All right, joining the show today, Mr. Kevin Noon. He's the director of multimedia content and the assistant editor at BuckeyesScoop.com. You've been around for a while. You work for Rivals, and right now you're covering the tournament, if I'm tracking that correctly. You were up in Pittsburgh this weekend, right, Kevin?
I was in Pittsburgh, but with Ohio State being done, I'm back home in Central Ohio. But yeah, it was a brief run by Ohio State, but we know that 68 teams go to the tournament and 67 are guaranteed to lose their final game with only one team left standing at the end. And for Ohio State, the run is over.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, we lost to Michigan this week, so the round of 32, that was fun. Tennessee, so we're right there with you. Didn't make it past this round. But let's talk a little bit. Let's start out a little bit about you, man. You kind of you've been, like I said, you've been around this business for a while. You've covered Ohio State for a while, from what I understand. And I always like bringing on different people to the show that cover different specific aspects, not just because there's, 133 teams right now that are now in, the FBS level of football, just in college alone. It's hard to keep track of it all. So to bring in these experts like you that cover that specific portion of football, I think it's very helpful, not just to me, but to any viewers out there. So how did you get into the business, man? How did you get this opportunity to cover Ohio State and kind of take it from there?
Yeah, I went to Ohio State, and when you're in the journalism field, generally you go where the job is. And I got lucky coming out of school and went right to a television station and worked 5 years on the affiliate level in Columbus. And then I worked 5 years for Fox National, and they were doing a recruiting show out of the hub that I was working in Dallas. And I was a big fan of college recruiting even before covering it. And I, developed a friendship with Bobby Burton, who was doing the show. And he at some point was like, well, it sounds like you're really interested in this. Is this something you've ever considered doing on a more permanent basis? I'm like, well, I don't know. And so we had a couple conversations that led to an interview, and I took a job with Rivals.com, and I worked for Rivals on the corporate level for a couple of years, and then the opportunity to cover Ohio State specifically opened up, and I did that for, I don't know, I guess 15 years. And then within the last 6 months, an opportunity arose to focus a little bit more on the multimedia things, which I really enjoy, with a background in television, and here I am.
That's awesome, man. And so what was it? What was the biggest thing that you kind of took away from studying at Ohio State? Because people that come out of that program, the school up north, a lot of those top tier Big Ten programs, there's a lot of school pride, and I think it kind of almost replicates the SEC to a certain extent. So, like, what was the biggest thing that you took away from studying there at Ohio State that you've been able to carry over?
Well, I think the thing for me is I'm originally from the West Coast, and at risk of alienating anybody from the West Coast, college football is not nearly as big out there as it is in the Midwest. And
Yeah.
I knew for a long time I wanted to get into sports writing or sports production of some sort. When I realized that I did not have the athletic talents to be a sports participant at a high level, I wanted to be close to the game any way possible, and that meant I was probably going to have to write about it. So going to Ohio State was eye-opening for me to see what college football was going to be all about. I had the opportunity to go to a USC UCLA game growing up, and it was all well and good, but I also had the opportunity to go to a USC, I think it was like Fresno State game at some point, something of a lesser magnitude, and there was 12 people and a small dog there. So it was, I think that was one of the biggest things. I mean, in the way you asked the question, I think academically, I'm not going to sound like a huge proponent of the college system when I say this. I learned so much more in real world experiences in my internship at CNN and some things that I did in that nature than I did in terms of production while I was at Ohio State. But you got to remember too, I'm 50 years old, so my college days were a long time ago, and the term MMJ, multimedia journalist, did not really exist back in the day. So it's a whole new world, and I've done a lot of work with Ohio State at my previous stop of having a couple of interns a year, and I think that we're seeing a lot different type of candidate coming out of school now in terms of being that MMJ, that multimedia journalist, because I didn't have access to the internet. I didn't have an email. I had a word processor toward the end of my time in college. It weighed about 30 pounds, and I remember once running through the airport at DFW with this thing slamming into my leg as I was trying to catch a flight. But my phone is a heck of a lot more powerful than any computer that I had access to. So I mean, it's a completely different world, and I think that we're seeing a lot of really good candidates coming out of schools these days, not just Ohio State, but it was a very different day, a very different program than what it was that I went through in the early 90s.
Yeah, and I think going back to that very first point that you made about the level, the magnitude of college football compared to the from the West Coast to even just the Midwest or the Southeast or any, just that this region, this pocket. Um, yeah, no, that's an interesting point because you're not the first person I've heard talk about that, the difference in those. So, yeah, Ohio State, you didn't have the opportunity to go to the combine, so I was trying to pass as much info as I could back to you as it pertained while I was there. And I think it was the first year in a while that you hadn't been able to go, right?
Right. I think it's like, other than the year that we just didn't have the combine, I think it's the
Right.
first time I've missed it in 12 years, something along those lines, 12 or 13.
But there's a lot of really intriguing talent coming out of Ohio State this year. It's not your typical, first, second, third Nick Bosa kind of players, but really intriguing talent that, from an NFL standpoint, someone like Tyreke Smith, someone like Thayer Munford Jr., you know, there's tools to work with, so looking at this draft from your angle, being in Ohio State, you know, multimedia journalist, what what do you kind of expect to see from Ohio State in this draft class?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's going to start at the top with receiver, with Chris Olavey and Garrett Wilson. I
Right.
think that there's a debate whether or not, are you Team Wilson? Are you Team Olave? I mean, there are two guys that were highly successful on the collegiate level. Garrett Wilson comes into college, a much higher rated recruit. I think people knew what to expect there. Chris Olave was more of just a late add into a class. Ohio State, and the story's been told before that Ohio State really only found him because they were recruiting his quarterback, Jack Tuttle, in coming out of high school, and then they saw this kid who missed a lot of time during his high school career due to injury. He comes in his freshman year, he doesn't do much until the Michigan game, has a couple of touchdowns against Michigan, and then he's off to the races at that point. And we could kind of get into the finer points of you know what what I think or what you think about each of those receivers, but that's the top end of the draft. I mean, and those are guys that I certainly would not be surprised to see be day one guys. And then
Mhm.
obviously you have a pair of linemen with Munford and with Petit Frere, Nicholas Petit Frere, and what goes on there. What is the strength of the lineman draft this season? And then yeah, you do have the defensive linemen. You have Tyrique Smith, who's a guy who came in with, very high press clippings and, had huge games and had games that maybe weren't as strong as you would have hoped for. And then you have on the inside of the line, you have Haskell Garrett, who, you don't necessarily, we don't fall in love with a lot of interior defensive linemen on draft shows because you've got your top cut, and then everybody else they're just grinders. I mean, not everybody's Cameron Hayward coming out of school and everything
Yeah,
there. But then again, I could sit there and say Jonathan Hankins has been in the league for a long time, and I don't think we were talking a ton about Jonathan Hankins and his draft status. And the dude's been a survivor. So I think it's not going to be the class that we saw Bosa, Ezekiel Elliott, all of these guys coming out of. But I think it's going to be a good class that's going to lead us into next year's draft class for Ohio State, which I think is going to be one of those ones that we'll talk about for multiple years.
I definitely want to get into that class, at some point, not just from a draft standpoint, but a college football 2022 standpoint, because yeah, CJ Stroud, all those receivers, Brian Hartline, the receivers coach that you guys have is talking these guys up a lot. I mean, he's done that over the years, but he seems really excited about this group. And I think they're getting better defensively. So there is something that would probably, before I cycle back to this draft stuff, it just popped in my head because I just remembered it, and it's been a while. But you guys had two linebackers transfer out after the Akron game. Dallas Gant, I believe, and there was another. What was his name?
Kayvon Pope.
Yeah, that's right. So it seemed, from an outsider standpoint, it seemed like as soon as those guys left the team, there was almost a breath of fresh air, and the team almost regathered and picked up that steam and made that push, throughout the season leading up into the game against Michigan. Was there something kind of going on behind the scenes that we know about with that team this year?
Well, I think you go back and you look at that recruiting class that had Dallas Gant, Kayvon Pope, and then Taraja Mitchell, who's still with the team. And it's just the nature of the game. You have 85 scholarships, and sometimes, you just get kind of pinned in between guys, that are a class ahead of you that you can't seem to surpass, and you're getting pushed from behind. And you look at the linebackers Ohio State had previously, including Tuff Borland, including Baron Browning, some guys like that, and this three-man class with that aforementioned class couldn't get to the field. And then the Borland, the Pete Werner, who's with the New Orleans Saints, Baron Browning, Justin Hilliard, they move on, and okay, it's our time to go, and they don't get they're not being played. They're not seeing the reps. They're certainly not starting. And I think that the frustration is, we sat there, we did our time, we waited, quietly, and we were available at a moment's notice, and now we're not getting our time. And I think that Dallas Gant handled it very differently than Kayvon Pope, who had he exploded during a game, and a very
Yeah,
unfortunate incident of where he threw his gloves into the stands and stormed off. And I mean, it was, in hindsight, he recognized that wasn't necessarily the best way of handling it either. But it's water under the bridge now. It's difficult. But so they move on. They don't, it doesn't necessarily affect the rotation in terms of that they were starters, but Ohio State got really thin in linebacker as the year went on, as guys were hurt. I mean, Cody Simon was playing
hmm
injured a lot of the way. Um, they were down to 5 linebackers at one point of healthy linebackers, just based on everything that was going on. So linebacker play wasn't necessarily a strength of Ohio State last year, and that's why you see new defensive coordinator Jim Knowles coming in and saying linebacker is going to be my position that I'm going to work with. I'm not going to just be a DC who oversees everything. I'm going to be a DC who I'm going to be a fighting champion. I'm going to work with a position. I'm going to work with linebackers. So it'll be interesting to see there, because Ohio State's depth was just not very good when you lose those two guys, mid-flight.
and that Akron game was interesting, and that things weren't going great there for a while. But I was curious about that because I remembered seeing that during the season and watching those guys transfer out and kind of going, I have to wonder if there was, something more going on, because that defense picked up a lot, leading up and through that stretch of the season where they won all those games, and bounced back from the Oregon loss and everything else. But uh, I guess we'll switch back over to the draft and stuff because you did mention those receivers, and those receivers are very good. And I mean, they both tested out of the water. I mean, I think for a little while there, we thought that they both broke sub 4.3, if I remember correctly.
Right. I think that we thought that Olavey ran a 4.26, and we've just found out that that having having a new person doing the unofficial timing in the NFL Network, with Charlie Casserly moving on, didn't work quite so well, and they ended up both being sub 4.4s, but not quite sub
Yeah,
4.3s.
yeah, and no, and I think still they tested extremely well, but you did mention that there is kind of this team Wilson, team Olave. I like to say that I'm a team player guy, and it doesn't matter who you are. I'm going to root for you to succeed, um, because I want players to to be successful at the next level, especially coming out of college. But in terms of their talent, I think that Olave isn't quite as good. He isn't quite the overall package that Garrett Wilson is. Um, because Wilson has that. I honestly think Wilson is a much better route runner. He has a better body control, and he's better in those contested catch opportunities. He makes those ridiculously acrobatic catches, you know, that come in clutch moments in the games at Ohio State over the last couple of years. But I think Wilson's the better guy, and I think I had just honestly mocked him 13 to the Browns before, you
Hmm.
know, everything
All hell
went kind
broke
of
loose.
haywire. Yeah, exactly. But I could see him going top 10. I think he's the best receiver in this class, hands down. I don't think there's anybody that brings the overall package and has the injury stuff put to rest like he does right now.
Yeah, I think that the way that I kind of describe them, and I've known them both obviously for multiple years. So I mean, okay, I'm a little too close to the situation, but I see I see Garrett Wilson as more dynamic, and I see Chris Olave as better rounded. So it's I don't know. You see Garrett Wilson, he goes out, he has that huge catch radius. He's able to do a lot of those things. He makes those spectacular catches. I worry a little bit about his in-game durability at times because he does get out there, and we use the term body control. We use it multiple ways depending on what's going on, and he sells himself out to make some of those catches, and his body control to make the catches great. And then I don't know if he protects himself, and then he comes down and he's hurt and he misses a series or two. I mean, he always gets back out there. I mean, it's not been a player who's had, oh, he's out for 3 games because of this, that, or the other. I mean, no. I mean, it's not injury prone. I think he just opens himself up for those little in-game injuries because of some of the things he does. When it comes to route running, I think all of the Ohio State receivers do a great job of running routes, but I actually like Olave's route running a little bit better. I think his tactical approach maybe is a little bit better, but again, I think we're really, splitting hairs. And, it is a solid receiver draft. I mean, obviously you have guys like Jamison Williams who you're
Came
really
from Ohio State.
you're really drafting to quote unquote to redshirt him because of the injury there. And, neither of these guys have the body of like a Drake London, but I'm hard pressed not to sit there and be looking at both of them just based on what Ohio State has been putting out in terms of receivers. I mean, we still sit there and we look at the Commanders and Terry McLaurin and what he's been able to do. Somebody who was not necessarily, he wasn't a high draft pick, and he's just gone on and has been a number one receiver on a pretty, you know, subpar organization for a couple of years that had not had a quarterback for him. And I don't know. I don't know who I like. I think it really comes down to a team needs type of situation. And while we're not
Yeah.
necessarily looking at huge body differences in terms of them, where we're looking at a big guy that can only play outside and a small guy that really needs to play inside. They're similar enough, but I still think that there's going to be, I think there's certain teams that Wilson might be a little better fit for. I think there's certain teams that Olave might be a little better fit for.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing too is, the projection process of, scouting and looking at guys, right? Because my first question is, you know, in terms of being a media scout, I have to do an overall talent review, right? So it's more I'm not looking for a certain scheme fit. I'm not looking for, a certain, the coach's preference. He wants this and this and that, because I'm looking at the overall draft class. And as a media person, that makes it a whole lot more difficult, because the NFL, they're looking at way less people than I am. Each NFL team is individually. And so when I kind of look at these two, I kind of see Garrett Wilson looks like he could be a number one receiver. And I think he could be a very good number one receiver. Top 10, top 15, at his prime, at the top of his game. And that's just because receivers right now are so stacked in the NFL. It's everywhere. They're doing amazing. This whole, evolution, I guess, of the passing game and opening up opportunities for guys. A lot of people want to play wide receiver. You've seen the high schools putting out all this talent over the last, 10 years, right? Going really back to that OBJ catch on Sunday night. That's like that one catch opened up the floodgates for this position. And we've been seeing this kind of talent just overloading the NFL. That being said, it's still very difficult to find a number one guy that, you could put on the outside at all times. Someone like you said, Terry McLaurin, someone like Julio Jones or AJ Green in their prime. And Wilson looks like that to me. And when I watch Olavey, I kind of see more of a very good number two, like a Z, someone that you're going to kind of slide in and out of the slot, someone that you're going to put out on the boundary, but he's going to be that complementary guy to that number one. And he'd be very good in that role. I just don't know if Olavey could be, an effective number one guy. That's what I see.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think for me, some of it too, though, is, I see all these number ones and, save Terry McLaurin. They're these gigantic, huge personalities, which Garrett Wilson is. Garrett Wilson is a talker on the field. I think that he's going to have to work on some of that in the league. Olavey is a little bit more measured. Does he kind of fade into the background in terms of, the personality contest that the league can be sometimes? I don't know, maybe there. I mean, he's certainly a second teamer in terms of being a talker, maybe even a third teamer. But, you sit there and you just look at what his career numbers were and what he does, and now how all he does is make plays. I mean, that's why there are people far smarter than me going out there and making these types of decisions, because I don't know. I mean, I would just trade up to take both of them, honestly, and call it a day. But then again, Matt Millen isn't in the front office anywhere to just draft receiver over and over and over and over again. So I don't know.
Moving on to some of these other guys that are in this class, coming out of Ohio State, like we mentioned, the offensive lineman, there's Munford and there's Nicholas Ferrer. I haven't looked at Petit Ferrer very in depth. I'll be straight up with that. But Munford I really liked, as a guy, because of his versatility, making the move from left tackle, left guard, really showed that he could play on the interior this year, and had the opportunity to speak with him at the combine a little bit. And I liked his composure, and I liked, his transparency. I thought he was a really open type personality, and I appreciate that in players. And so at Ohio State with these guys on the offensive line, and, being close to the program and everything, what do you know about these guys, and what have you seen so far?
I mean, I like them both. I mean, we'll start with Thayer Munford. I mean, Munford was a great story. I mean, he really fought to get that Ohio State offer. I mean, he spent time living with one of his coaches as he went to Massillon, which is obviously a powerhouse football program within the state of Ohio. Nothing was necessarily given to him, but I think he was kind of tapped to be, it has to, he's somebody who has kind of had a steady rise. He's not one of these guys you look at and it's like, oh wow, I could just see it right off the bat. He jumps off the page. He's like this first round lineman. No, but I mean, I think if you look at his career, you look at him moving from one side to the other, he's done a great job with Nick Petit Ferrer. He came in as the 5-star. I mean, he was the guy you look at and you're like, okay, this guy is going to be, your lineman of the future. Poor guy couldn't put weight on. You know, I wish I had that issue. I mean, it took him a couple of years to get there, to get to the weight that Ohio State wanted him at. I mean, he was having to wake up at 2 a.m. and have meals and stuff to try and keep the weight on. He finally keeps the weight on. He's had it. Has a lot of good tape. He has some maybe tape that you want to bury a little bit. Just, Big Ten's talented. He's gone against some dudes there. I think Petit Frere would have really benefited coming back one more year just to learn under Justin Fry, who's come over from UCLA to Ohio State, just to get a little bit more seasoning there. But you make that decision before a lot of other things have happened to go to the league, and I don't think he's somebody who suddenly moves up around by staying another year, but he's somebody who certainly didn't get that early run in his career because he couldn't get to weight.
And he still looks like he could put on a good bit onto his frame. He still looks like he's a little bit on the small side, and NFL can, strength and conditioning rooms. We've seen what they do to players. Like, they build these guys up, but it is a little bit of a concern when that's been going on throughout your career. With unable to keep the weight and stuff like that. So he still looks small, to me. Just looking at him, still a little bit like he has a lot of room to build on that frame, but we'll see. I really liked Munford. Like I said, I really liked Munford. I think he's the better of the two. I don't know if he's going to be able to play tackle potentially at the next level, but his guard play this year, it was a real difference, on tape compared to when he was playing out there at the left tackle. Tyreke Smith had the chance to go to the Senior Bowl, right? And played pretty well there. Unfortunately, in practice, he was matched up most of the time against Trevor Penning, and that was Penning being over aggressive, kind of tossing him around a little bit. He really showed out once they got on the field and played the other team. He's kind of an interesting player. He's a little bit, I guess if you had a lesser edge class compared to normal, we'd be talking about him as a surefire second round pick, maybe sliding into the first. But right now we're kind of talking about him as a 2-3. So, what about Tyreke Smith? Do you think he's going to show to separate, and kind of what would you expect to see from him at the next level?
I think that he's somebody that just needs to work on some consistency. I think it's going to be great though when he is on a team of where he doesn't necessarily have to be the guy. He doesn't have to carry the water the whole way. Mm-hmm. I think that if Ohio State has had a lot of linemen that that have benefited for having a Bosa or a Young on the line, and you're not the guy getting 2 or 2.5 people trying to chip you and everything else. If you're able to go and kind of play straight up, I think he's somebody who can have some success. I don't think he's going to be, I don't know if I see him being somebody that's going to be, impact play after impact play after impact play, but I don't know if that's necessarily you're going to be getting him a little bit lower down the draft board. You're going to get some value in that pick, and he could surprise you. We see a lot of times that we're like, oh well, this guy, going 4 or 5, that'll be fine or whatever, and then they come in and they overperform. I think he certainly has shown at times that he's unblockable. They've shown at times mm-hmm. that he can just do it all. And then, there have been other games of where he, disappeared. But once when you sit there and you turn this from being college football to professional football, and this becomes your life, the light certainly goes on.
I liked him a lot on tape, and I think that's a really good point that you have about if he's not a number one guy, if he's not your number one, pass rusher, and someplace that I think he could probably end up fitting well would be someplace like, Philadelphia, for example. Not just because I'm wearing the Eagles shirt or anything, but no, but like, they run that rotational defensive line. They like to rotate their defensive ends through. They have Josh Sweat and a couple others there right now, and I could see Tyreke Smith fitting into that really, really well, into that kind of a role where he's playing 30 snaps a game and being asked to just play at a high level those 30 snaps. And that's value. That's there's a lot of teams that have switched to that because that was the formula when the Eagles won the Super Bowl a few years ago, was having that fresh defensive line throughout the entire game, and putting Brady on his back in the fourth quarter. Not a lot of people do that. So was there a DB that was coming out this year?
So the only other player that was at the combine was Jeremy Ruckert, the tight end.
That's right.
I mean, but we haven't really talked about Haskell Garrett either.
You're right. So yeah, because basically my draft document right now is still a little bit of a mess because I put anybody who's draft eligible in it, and I haven't moved the Ohio State guys that aren't draft eligible. I mean, that decided to stay yet. So I'm like, oh my god, I'm sorting through this. All right, so let's actually start with Haskell Garrett because we'll stay on the defensive line. This is a big dude. He's probably a 3-tech at the next level. I have my notes here. He drew double teams a lot, consistently while he was at Ohio State, and shows the ability to win, get inside leverage on those double teams. And that's an important role right now in the league. Having that ability to, play the 3-tech and draw a double team, because that's essentially what you want. You're trying to get your one-on-one with the tight end, with your edge rusher on the edge. If you have 2 3-tech guys that'll take double teams, you're going to get that tight end. And I think that's somebody that could potentially get pushed up. And he's another Senior Bowl guy too. So what was it about Haskell Garrett that stood out while he was at Ohio State, as the person, as, the prospect?
Well, I think one of the stories, I'm sure it's out there. I mean, off the field, he, saw an altercation. He got involved. He got shot in the face. I mean, it was a scary situation. I mean, it obviously could have gone a lot worse. They had to wire his jaw shut. I mean, you obviously miss a little bit of time when you get, shot in the face, but I mean, he gets out there and he plays. So, I mean, he's a tough dude. I mean, he is a really tough dude. And again, it's a situation of where you look at somebody who had games to where he was just on fire and he couldn't be stopped. I mean, he has a couple defensive touchdowns of his own. I mean, when you see the interior lineman tip the ball at the line of scrimmage and complete the interception and score the touchdown. I mean, those are always those types of highlight plays. I think something for both of the Ohio State defensive linemen is to remember, while they're learning under Larry Johnson, one of the best defensive linemen in the college game, I just don't think that Ohio State's defense last season is something that you can only put that tape in and say, well, this is what these guys are. Because remember, Ohio State made a defensive coordinator change mid-season. I mean, once again, you're reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic at that point, and it wasn't like they went out and got somebody else. But, you were looking at a team that moved away from, and while we're going to talk so much about what the back end is, being a team that's single high, going to something more cover 2, cover 4, I don't necessarily like what the plan was last year in terms of how they handled the defensive line. So I think in some ways they kind of stunted what these guys were going to be able to do. Yeah, you're going to be able to go out and make athletic plays, but I don't think that they allowed them really to pin their ears back and get to the quarterback. I think there was a lot more contain in there than there was anything. And then maybe that doesn't necessarily, fit as much in terms of when we're talking about a defensive tackle, but yeah, Garrett was mauled a lot because teams would just put everybody they could on him, because there were certainly games to where he was by far the best defensive player on the field for Ohio State during the entire game. So I think Garrett's somebody that could go out there and within the right system, you could give you give you 30, 35 snaps and be highly productive. I think that, especially if you put them on a team that's got, some pretty solid ends that are going to draw a lot of attention, and you let Garrett to go out there and do his job, I think you could be pretty happy with him.
And so you maybe that not letting the defensive line go after the quarterback, maybe that was in part to what you were talking about with the linebacker depth this year, and not wanting to put those guys into high stress, high pressure situations and trying to kind of protect them a little bit more and make their job a little bit easier. But I do agree. I think that, the defense was different this year. Not just because of the defensive coordinator change, but because of all the different circumstances that were going around, the injuries that you guys had this year too. I think that really kind of slowed everybody down. But I like Garrett. I think he's I was actually talking to Mark Gorsink at the combine, right? 40-yard draft, 40-yard dash scout that runs that event. And he was telling me that there are, I think it's 5% of the American population is over 6'2", 200 pounds. Garrett is 6'2", 300 pounds. He said, if you could find that kind of a body, you hold on to them. Doesn't matter if they can run, if they can do things, you hold on to them. And I think that's kind of where Garrett kind of fits in. You've got a guy that can take those double teams. He's got the build, he's got the size. You can kind of work on, the finer tuned technique with him and develop him into a better player.
Yeah, well, but you can pass my information on because I'm 6'2", 280. So, but I'm not very athletic. So I don't know what to say there.
The last guy in this class, like you mentioned, is because we didn't talk about him, I missed him, is the tight end Jeremy Ruckert. And this is an explosive guy, right? This is a guy that, he can kind of be that vertical threat. He was a little bit at Ohio State, but I think he's a good overall tight end. And so what is there for us to know about Jeremy Ruckert?
I think we take a step back and we look at tight ends at Ohio State in general. And Ohio State is not a program that uses the tight end a lot in terms of as a pass catcher. I think 25 receptions in a year is a really good year for an Ohio State tight end. And people will be like, well, that's not great. Well, when are you not going to be throwing the ball to Garrett Wilson, Chris Olavey, Jackson Smith-Njigba, or running the ball with Trevion Henderson? I mean, it's a situation of something's got to give. Jeremy Ruckert comes out of the New York City area as a, I look at him as that skilled tight end, kind of maybe somebody even you look at. I don't necessarily say that you flex him, but he is more of a big receiver than a tight end in a lot of ways because he's just not that attached tight end that you see out there being a mauler. It's always curious when you see that type of guy saying, I'm going to go to Ohio State. It's like, why? They're not going to throw it to you a lot. Well, he made the most out of the opportunities that he got there. I think that he's somebody who's highly athletic. I think he does he's a solid blocker. I mean, he's 10,000% the blocker now of what he was when he came in because you don't necessarily understand just what the expectations are at the college game of being a blocker. And Ohio State absolutely wants to have its blocking tight ends. But I go and I look at some previous tight ends from Ohio State that certainly have had their opportunities in the league with Nick Vannett and with before him Jeff Hireman, guys that necessarily weren't talking about a ton, and they go on and for Jeff Hireman, he had a couple years in the league. Nick Vannett, I think he's still in the league at this point. Mm-hmm. So I think that Jeremy Ruckert, if you just sit there and you put them just athletic talents, I think Ruckert is probably tests a little bit higher than the other two in terms of athleticism. And, I think that somebody could get themselves a nice little pickup there. But I'll tell you, I mean, I'm glad I don't have to be in your chair picking things like this out, because I couldn't have told you that Dalton Schultz was going to do what he did, with Dallas. I mean, I don't know how to evaluate tight ends in the in any way, shape, or form, apparently, and I only mean that in a football sense.
Now, now, Schultz was a surprise to a lot of people. I don't think a lot of us expected to see that, but that is an interesting point that you bring up, because there are people that do knock Rucker, for his production and the lack thereof in terms of college. I'm a guy. I typically don't really pay too much attention to the stats unless it's important. I think some things that are important, for example, are on some more advanced stat stuff. PFF has the missed tackles and drop catches, things like that. I think those are important. Snap counts are important. But overall production and stuff at the college level, it doesn't always correlate to success. You have a lot of guys that are extremely productive in college. They might intercept a lot of passes. They might collect a lot of sacks, and they're not going to do that at the next level. Just because they don't have the skill set, they just ended up in the right spot, the right place, the right time, and it worked out for them. But I like Rucker as a, potentially as a vertical guy, not something that he was used a lot at Ohio State. I mean, he was, a 4-star prospect coming out. I've got him, Phil Steele had him as the 3rd ranked tight end, when he was coming out of high school. And he's a guy that, like you said, wasn't really utilized because, I mean, you have these ungodly playmakers everywhere else on the field. Why are you going to throw it to Jeremy Rucker? So I think he could be a surprise, somebody that kind of slips into that 3rd, 4th, 5th round range and becomes a productive guy at the next level just because of that. I like Rucker. I think he's going to be cool. This year, you guys have a huge opportunity. Michigan beat you guys this past year for the first time in a long time. And they lost a lot of that talent to the NFL that beat you guys. A lot of the key players, the edge rushers that tortured your quarterback are gone. The DBs for the most part are gone. The safeties, both of them. Some of those offensive linemen are gone. The running back is gone. And you guys, outside of the receivers and the few guys that we've mentioned, are still together. You're still a very compact team compared to what Michigan lost last year. And when you look across the Big Ten, I think that Ohio State right now has on paper the most complete team and are the most primed to make that run at the playoff. So I guess we could start with CJ Stroup because he's going to be a really great quarterback. What are you kind of hearing around the program about Stroup, about his leadership, about some of the stuff in the locker room, and what he's been working on?
Yeah, I mean, Stroud doesn't necessarily look like the biggest talker, but you don't have to be this super loud guy to be the leader of the team. But I think it's a process. I mean, not everybody's JT Barrett, who came in and was a leader as a freshman, and then again, JT Barrett was also thrust into the situation due to a couple quarterbacks going down leading up to that excuse me, to that 2014 season. But a year older Stroud is going to be just that much better in terms of the intangibles. I mean, I think that when it comes to his football playing ability, he is who he is. I mean, he's going to continue to get better, but it's when you backfill everything else, you backfill the leadership, you backfill the trust that is, amongst the teammates, even more so than just the trust between the quarterback and the receiver. I think as everybody has more buy-in, it's just going to be that much more dangerous. And we have the opportunity to see what CJ Stroud is going to look like in a post-Olavey, post-Wilson world in the Rose Bowl when he didn't have either of them there, and he obliterates records in there. I mean, obviously he had a couple of cheat codes in Jackson Smith-Njigba and Marvin Harrison Jr. And I mean, Ohio State is much more deeper at receiver than just those two. But we're looking at guys. Jackson Smith-Njigba is a surefire 1st round draft pick next year, and Marvin Harrison Jr. I mean, he's that big body receiver that everybody seems to love there too. I mean, he could end up being Drake London. I mean, so yeah, I think it's going to be a year of where you're going to see a CJ Stroud that's going to be even more focused. That they're not going to be the people coming in the first couple games saying, "I think they made the wrong choice. I think they need to be playing Kyle McCord." They're not. I mean, knock on wood, there's not going to be any injuries that are going to have him not participate in the Akron game because of a shoulder injury. And somebody who, probably felt a little disrespected. I mean, okay, you get to go to New York for the Heisman ceremony. Oh, you're fourth. Oh, Desmond Howard is gonna talk you on national television. I mean, I think we're going to see a really motivated kid this year.
And Stroud, just from a quarterbacking standpoint, you watched him progress so much after that Oregon loss, right? Just the understanding the field, seeing the coverages kind of as the play develops and understanding that more, you saw that confidence build throughout the entire season as he just got better and better. And that's exciting looking forward to this upcoming year because, like you said, Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison Jr. Now that's funny right there that Harrison Jr. has that body type that his dad didn't, and it's like, could he be potentially better than his dad? Maybe. He doesn't hold the NFL record for receptions anymore, I don't think, but still, he's that legendary guy that a lot of people always wanted to kind of put down because he didn't have the size, and now here's his son who has the size and is that big guy. But I think that's awfully ironic. And then you guys have the running backs too, right? Like you guys have Travion Henderson. Did Master Teague decide to come back this year?
No, Master Teague he has moved on. He entered his name into the draft. Obviously was not at the combine, but he didn't go grad transfer somewhere else. I mean, he's moved on. I mean, yeah, it's really going to be Travion Henderson in that running back room, and then whether or not it's Mayan Williams, Marcus Crowley is going to be coming off of a long-term injury. I mean, they've got Evan Pryor coming back for year 2. They've got Dallin Hayden, who's the son of Aaron Hayden. He'll be coming in as a true freshman at running back. I mean, they're going to have some guys, but once again, this offense is really going to be about that receiver room because we can talk about JSN and we can talk about Marvin Harrison. What we haven't talked about is Julian Fleming, another 6'4" type of receiver. We haven't talked about Emeka Egbuka, who is, kind of like a Jameson Williams type there. We haven't gone through those types of guys. Cameron Babb is a guy who's been in the program for multiple years, has had multiple injuries, appears to be healthy. We could see a Johnny Dixon type of story here in terms of a guy who looked like he was about a second away from medically retiring and comes out and has a big year. Oh, and then by the way, Ohio State is bringing in 4-star receivers for, as true freshmen. And while not all of them are going to get the opportunity to play this year, the cupboard is far from bare. But once again, based on what we saw in that Rose Bowl, it's gonna be an embarrassment of riches with the two guys at the top, at least in terms of what we saw in that game. But certainly, don't want to take stuff away from Julian Fleming and Emeka Egbuka and guys like that who have put a couple years on the program as well.
Who's the biggest concern on the schedule at this point? If you're Ohio State in the upcoming year, are you worried about anybody during the year, or is this kind of on paper we're looking really good, we might be able to make a run all the way to the playoff and then start worrying?
Well, you say that, and then you get labeled as arrogant or whatever. So, I think if I were a coach, I'd say, well, you have to be worried about every game. Well, I'm not a coach, so I don't have to say that. I think you worry about Notre Dame because it's week 1. And what a team is in week 1 versus what a team is in week 7 or week 13 is very different. And while I think Notre Dame has got plenty to replace on that roster, and I'm not a Notre Dame expert by any stretch of the imagination, you always wonder what you're going to look like in week 1. And then you always have to worry about that last game against Michigan. I mean, Michigan is going to come in with a 1-game winning streak against Ohio State, and you're going to have to you'll worry about it. I mean, granted, the game is in Columbus. Granted, there's a lot of things in Ohio State's favor, but this Michigan team that is without all of these guys that you mentioned, all of the guys that are their replacements will have 11 games of experience at this point. They will not be, they'll be first time players in the game, but they won't be first time starters or anything along those lines. And I also think that when you talk about Michigan, you look at a team too that Mike McDonald, the defensive coordinator, is back in Baltimore. I mean, that was a short-term rental from John Harbaugh to Jim Harbaugh. Now John's like, I need him back. You sit there and you look on, the other side of the ball. I mean, Josh Gaddis now is with the Miami Hurricanes. I mean, he's no longer in the program. So, and I think it's not as much. I don't think it's going to be as dramatic of a change offensively because, they had one of those young analytic type of guys as an assistant under Gaddis that remains with the program. I think he's just going to have a little bit more of a prevalent role, and I don't remember who it is that he's sharing duties with. But, you're looking at a program that's going to have a lot of coaching changes, just like Ohio State did on the defensive side of the ball. But more importantly, Michigan's going to have a lot of roster changes with no Hassan Haskins, with no Aiden Hutchinson, with no Daxton Hill. I mean, and we can go on and on and on and on.
Notre Dame is going to be they're always a tough task. And, I think you can point at that last bowl game and you look at that first half that they had against Oklahoma State that was just outstanding when they just, at that point, I think a lot of us were, turned the game off and we're like, yeah, this is over and I've got better things to do right now. And they blew it. But you have that young coach. You have a lot of momentum behind him, retaining a lot of that staff from Brian Kelly, who went down to LSU, and you do wonder what that's going to look like in week one and how much momentum they can build and retain with that over the off season. But I gotta say, it's kind of hard to see, like a Notre Dame offense being able to get into a shootout with Ohio State and come out on top right now because this offense is just so potent and so loaded.
Well, and you talk about this young coach at Notre Dame, that would be Marcus Freeman, who played his college football at Ohio State, and who certainly has, he had an ill-advised interview, whether or not it was taken a little out of context, which I don't know how you take it out of context, but he says something along the lines of basically the premise was, I had the opportunity to go to Notre Dame as a player, and I chose Ohio State. All right, and I'm not going to make that mistake again, or something like that. Which, of course, just had everybody in Columbus and the state of Ohio howling with anger over that one. So, you don't necessarily need locker room material. They've got it against Notre Dame. They've got it against Michigan because you had backup quarterback J.J. McCarthy come out and, with something along the lines, all we know is winning against Ohio State or something like that.
Oh, my God.
Don't. I'm not a huge proponent of, you need this extra motivation. If you need the motivation to win these games, you're probably not the right guy. But but don't provide it either. I mean, I was in the scrum many years ago when Andy Katzenmoyer, talked about what his summer school courses were and the firestorm that came out of that. I was in a media scrum when Terry Glenn announced that Michigan ain't nothing, and then when Ohio State couldn't beat Michigan, and in true to form, Ohio State lost to Michigan again that year. Don't do that stuff. Young athletes, just yes, you make my job easier when you pop off and say stupid stuff, but for your own career path, don't do that because we have to report it. It's not like we're going to sit there and be like, oh, we're not going to do that to you. We saw what you did. You told us this on the record. So, don't.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested to see what Ohio State's going to do this year. Honestly, I think that it's very hard pressed to find, four better teams than them coming into the season in college football right now that could make a push for the playoff over them. I mean, obviously it comes down to execution. And when you look at, this past year, that's what kept Ohio State out was just the execution against Oregon, against Michigan. And, they've all got a year of experience under their belt now where they kind of dealt with some of those struggles, and you have to think that, with under Ryan Day's leadership and under that entire coaching staff there, things are looking up.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a really interesting year because of what Ohio State has. I mean, the schedule is favorable. I mean, Ohio State has been close. I mean, has been really close. It's I'm excited to see what the year holds, and I mean, I think it's going to be a huge referendum in a lot of ways. And no, this isn't saying, oh well, Ryan Day has to win X amount for no, he's fine, but with the changes he's made on the defensive side of the ball in terms of the coaches, with bringing in Jim Knowles, with bringing in Perry Eliano from Cincinnati, with bringing in Tim Walton back from Jacksonville in the NFL back into the college game, bringing in Justin Fry from UCLA with the offensive line. I think it goes to show that Ryan Day knows kind of what didn't seem to work last year and is willing to make the changes. So often, I think one of the downfalls that we see of a lot of coaches is that we just see this loyalty to their guys. And when you have your loyalty to your guys and you don't make these changes, that's where you run into issues. So for a head coach to come in and kind of blow up his staff and kind of start over in a lot of positions, I think that's an interesting study to see what ends up coming out of that, because I really think that, I think that Ohio State's defense was, while it wasn't one of the worst ones that we've seen in the last couple of years, it certainly was a stumbling point when you see the points that were given up to Oregon, the points that were given up to Michigan, and even the points that were given up to Utah. And, Ohio State was just able to outscore Utah where it couldn't outscore Michigan or Oregon by making those changes. I mean, he's thrown the gauntlet down and said, we're doing this. We're going to do this, in 22. And, time will tell. I mean, it's not always necessarily that the best team on paper is going to be the one that wins, whether it be in terms of players or coaching roster. I mean, things happen. Nobody would have predicted the loss to Purdue several years ago. Nobody would have predicted the loss to Iowa several years ago. Sometimes it's just not your day. But Ryan Day is not going to let things happen. He's not going to just sit there and accept what kind of stymied them last year. He's gone out and made the changes, and now it's going to be up for everybody involved to implement those changes and to move past, some of the shortcomings.
Interesting. I wasn't tracking those defensive coaching changes, and this is why I like bringing on people like you, and you cover a specific team, because there's 130, like I said earlier, there's 133 different schools just at the FBS level. That's not Division One. There's a whole FCS level that's still considered Division One, and trying to keep track of all this movement every year. At this point, the last couple months and this point of the year, and spring training is about to get started for a lot of people if it hasn't already. It's insane trying to keep up with it, and it's really helpful. You have somebody who's focused on one of those things, and you can just have a good conversation and talk about a lot of this stuff and kind of get back on track. That's great for them, man. That's awesome. So I guess the last kind of question that I'll pose right here is, what are your expectations for Ohio State this year, and what should we kind of expect to see from them overall, offensive, defense? Is there a precedent that it's playoffs or bust for Ohio State this year? And any other comments or anything else that you might want to throw in there?
Well, I think the expectations every year are to make it to the playoffs, win the Big Ten, beat that team up north, and get to the playoffs. I mean, you go back 15, 20 years ago, and it's win the Big Ten, beat that team up north, and go to the Rose Bowl. But we're in a very different world now with college football playoff and everything else. And last year, fans were just belly aching about, oh, well, we have to go to the Rose Bowl, because the Rose Bowl wasn't a CFP semifinal game. And, it is what it is. So I don't think that having the expectations of doing all of that is wrong, because those are the expectations every year. But I think that this year, just based on what Ohio State's returning, I think based on the gap between Ohio State and everybody else in the Big Ten in terms of talent, I think that, once again, you got to go out there and win all of your league games. And I think, for when you look at what this team is, we'll start on the defensive side because, let's end on a high note with the offense. I mean, the defense wasn't great last year. I mean, it certainly, I think everybody got a little spoiled who watches Ohio State of thinking, well, okay, who's going to be the next Bosa brother? Who's going to be the next Chase Young? And generational players are generational for a reason. And the fact that Ohio State had them, back to back to back the way that they did is tough. So if you're a Zach Harrison, if you're somebody like that, and everybody's like, okay, you're going to be the guy, or Jack Sawyer now, who has affectionately been called the third Bosa brother. I mean, it's a lot of pressure to be under because those guys are freaks and those guys are making bank in the NFL. Those guys are making bank. So I think that the expectations are, the defense has to be more aggressive. I think that the defense has to, obviously, you look, it wasn't like Ohio State was giving up a ton of points, but it's because you had, they went up against some pretty anemic offenses too. And when you're able to hold teams to 7 and 10, that keeps your scoring average down, even if you give up, 31 in a game. So I think that we need to see a more aggressive defense. I think we need to see some more clearly defined roles. I think a win is not changing your entire defensive scheme, mid-season. It wasn't even like they had an open week to try and do things, but they realized what wasn't working. And I think a huge step is Ryan Day recognizing we can't have our defense just being something I don't like going against. He didn't like going against single high cover one type of situations. Well, he brings in Jim Knowles from Oklahoma State, and the Cowboy defense was fantastic last year.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, Jim, you are the head coach of the defense. Now, Ryan Day's not going to turn a blind eye to the defense and be like, well, I don't know, not my problem. But this is Jim Knowles' problem to fix and his ship to captain. And I think that's going to be huge for Ohio State moving forward. So I think we're going to see a huge step forward in terms of defense because of clearly defined defensive tenets and goals and everything else. And while I still think Ohio State, isn't necessarily out of the linebacker woods at this point, I think that they're going to be able to get more out of the position. I think that they're going to be pretty strong in the secondary. Denzel Burke will be going into his second year starting. He will only be a second-year player, so we won't be talking about him for draft purposes after, 365 days from now. But whatever, 365 times 2, we'll be talking about him. He's the next in line in terms of being that great Ohio State corner. So I think that we're going to see a step up largely in terms of the defense. Then on the offensive side of the ball, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think we're going to see a little bit more. We saw Trevion Henderson, a running back, burst on the scene and have all these huge moments. He certainly hit the freshman wall. He was a player who didn't get a senior season in high school due to state-by-state issues in terms of whether or not you were going to have a high school season or you were going to play in the spring. He didn't have a senior season, so that it was what it was. But I think that Justin Fry coming in, I think they're going to be able to address some things in terms of what the offensive line is. Yes, replacing Thayer Munford. Yes, replacing Nick Petit-Frere is going to be an issue, but you're going to see Ohio State be able to kick Paris Johnson out from guard to tackle, his real position, and I think that's going to be a huge thing. I think you're going to see Ohio State return some guys on the line who are going to do just fine, but I think that we're going to need to see a little bit more run-pass balance, and I get it. Oh, so you're going to take things away from your legitimate. You have 3 Heisman candidates, honestly, between Stroud, JSN, and Trevion Henderson. You're going to take the ball out of his hand a little bit and not have him throw. I think you have to have a little bit more of a run threat there. But, you're going to get a big year out of these Ohio State receivers unless aliens kidnap Brian Hartline or something. It's such a well-oiled machine. At the end of the day, I think that the only thing that I would say that the line struggled with last year was run blocking, and I think they're going to get some of that fixed. So I think you're going to be looking at a team that's still going to be putting up 40-some points a game, and if Ohio State's able to just bring their points allowed down a couple of points and really get that balance because nobody has a big game against them, it's going to be a team that's going to be left standing at the end, get to Indianapolis, and then go on to the playoffs.
I agree. I think that this is going to be a great freaking team this year, and like I said before, it's really hard pressed to find anybody, you know, any four teams that are better than them. They're really, you could even say really two. I think Alabama and Georgia are obviously going to be those competitive teams, because they just reload every year and they just manage to pull that talent and they coach extremely well. But you look across this league, this nation right now, and you're hard pressed to find those teams that are better than Ohio State. So you cover right now at BuckeyesScoop.com, and you can find your Twitter at Kevin_Noon. Is there anywhere else people can find your stuff?
Yeah, I also have a podcast through YouTube and through all the other podcasting platforms called the Big Me Kickoff. People were like, "Why is it the Big Me Kickoff?" I said, "Well, the Big Noon Kickoff was already taken by Fox. I'm Noon, so therefore it's the Big Me Kickoff." My performance on that show has been a little sporadic as of late in terms of how many shows I've done. I promise to pick it back up, but you can find me on YouTube over on the Buckeye Scoop channel, and of course you can find me on Apple Podcasts and Spreaker and all these other things on the Big Me Kickoff.
That's awesome, man. So be sure to check out the Big Me Kickoff with Kevin Noon. That's awesome. I love that name. That's awesome. uh, yeah, man. It was a pleasure having you on here, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this and kind of update me and everybody else on Ohio State. Looking forward at this, not just the draft, but at the 2022 season.
Absolutely, anytime.
Appreciate it, man.